Okay, so chapter 11, verse number 1, we get into the laws of kosher, which is a fascinating topic in this week's portion of Shmini. It's actually, it's nice that the last two Torah portions of Vayikra and Tzav are, although fascinating, aren't necessarily very practical, relevant in a again, all of Torah is meant to teach me how to live my life, but the last two Torah portions spoke about sacrifices. The next two Torah portions of Akrimos and Kedoshim also go back to a lot of the, the next two Torah portions of Tazria Metzora focus a lot on the laws of Tzara'as, which is the biblical skin disease, which again today is not as very practically relevant. Certainly mystically and the ideas behind it are continuing to be relevant. But in the middle of that, we have, towards the end of this week's Torah portion, an extremely practical area of Judaism, which is the laws of kosher. You know, even though generally speaking, I like to avoid using labels for Jews, right? Orthodox or conservative or reformed or unaffiliated, affiliated. So generally speaking, we are one people, and we try not to label people or separate people. But for the fact of the matter is that there is a sort of a line which is crossed, in which people are then described as observant Jews, or some we call frum. And what is that line? You know, where would you say, what areas of observance really cause a person to be what's called frum, which means observant? And I think what's commonly thought is that there are two, maybe three mitzvahs, which when committed to really mean a person has made that commitment to Jewish observance or to frumkeit. And those three mitzvahs are, the first, I would say, is probably Shabbos, because the commitment to be Shabbos observant is well, I'll explain why after I say all three. The first is Shabbos. The second, I would say, is kosher. And the third, and again, this is not based on any sources, no one in the Talmud to say this. This is just perspective. And the third, I would say, and this is one which is connected more to those who are married, and certainly those in their in the early part of marriage, or the first part of marriage, I should say, is Taharat HaMishpacha, which is the laws of family purity. Those are the three which I think really distinguish one's commitment and one's observance. Why these three? Is it because Shabbos is more important than, I don't know, than Tefillin, or Shabbos is more important than Yom Kippur? No, you know, the Torah doesn't tell us that these three are more important than any. So what is it about these mitzvahs which make a person, which put a person to some degree in another category as far as their commitment to God? I think the answer is because these three mitzvahs, you really have to plan your life around. You know, someone can be very observant of Yom Kippur, and once a year they fast, and they do Yom Kippur as in the most beautiful way possible. You know, they fast and they do tshuva, but you don't really have to plan your life differently if you observe Yom Kippur. You can live however you like, wherever you like, and then one day a year you do Yom Kippur. And to some degree, you can say that about many mitzvahs, like Pesach, or like even a mitzvah like wearing tzitzis or Shabbos candles, in which I make a commitment, but I don't shape my life around that mitzvah. The mitzvahs that I mentioned, those three, you really have to plan your life around. If someone commits to being Shabbos observant, then that's going to affect where you live, because you're going to live in an area where there's probably other Shabbos observant people, where you can walk to a shul. You can't drive one day a week. You can't turn on your phone. So your career is going to be affected by that. You can't take a job which requires you to work till 6 o'clock every Friday, because during the wintertime, 6 p.m., Shabbos sometimes comes in at 5 p.m. And so Shabbos is one of those, someone who is Shabbos observant, you really have to plan your life around. It's very difficult to be married to someone in which one partner is Shabbos observant, the other is not. It exists. It does exist. I know such couples, but it's really complicated because one partner wants to go shopping and wants to go to a weekend family trip on Disneyland and spend Saturday, and the other partner says, I can't. So it complicates marriage. So really it affects every part of life is if you're Shabbos observant. And to a slightly lesser degree, kosher is the same way. If you keep kosher and you're strictly observant of kosher, then there's certain places you're not going to live, certain places you're not going to move to because there's no kosher food. When you're planning a vacation, you're planning it around, is there kosher food? You can't just go anywhere and plan to have to eat in whatever restaurants are available. So not as much as Shabbos, but the observance of kosher also is one which affects one's entire life. And the third, which is the least of these three within this category, is family purity, because that's much more of a private mitzvah between a husband and wife. But again, it's not just the observance of a mitzvah, and again, back to the kosher idea. Again, using the example of marriage, it's very difficult to have a marriage in which one partner is kosher observant, the other is not. With Yom Kippur, with other mitzvahs, you can make a commitment on your own. With kosher and with Shabbos, it's really challenging if it's not a family commitment. And the same is with Taras HaMishpacha, which absolutely has to be a commitment that a husband and wife make together. But furthermore, because it has to do with the process of a mikvah, you have to live near a mikvah. It affects the intimacy that exists within a marriage. So again, it is a mitzvah which affects all of life. And so therefore, as we go into one of those three, which is the laws of kosher, it's important to highlight, even though it's only one out of 613 commandments. I wouldn't say one because there's many mitzvahs connected to kosher, but it is one of those mitzvahs which really affects all of life. And we could all be a little bit more careful in the area of kosher. And therefore, as the Torah portion talks about it, let us each think to ourselves how we can commit ourselves a little bit more fully to the mitzvah of kosher. With that, let's jump into the text and let's see if we can share some ideas connected to the laws of kosher. Chapter 11, the book of Leviticus, verse number 1, by Dabar Hashem el Moshe vel Aaron, Lemor Alehem. And God speaks to Moshe and to Aaron and tells them. Verse number 2, Dabru el Bnei Yisrael, you together should speak to the Jewish people and tell them, Zos hachai asher tochlu, these are the creatures that you may eat, mikol habehema asher al haaretz, of all of the animals that are on earth. Now, in this verse, we see that the Torah is referencing the two different types of animals. One is called behema, and one is called chaya. A behema usually is a domesticated animal, a cow, a goat, and a chaya is a wild animal, like what we call a non-domesticated animal, like a deer. A deer is perhaps the most common example of a kosher non-domesticated animal. So this is the both are mentioned in this verse, chaya and behema. Let's just read the message. Let's just read the message of the second message of the Rashi. Zos hachaya, these are the creatures. Lashon chayim, the word chaya is connected to life. Lefi, the reason being, sheYisrael dvukim bamakom u'ru'uyim liyos chayim. The Jewish people are connected, cleave to God, therefore are worthy of life. Lefika chivdila min hatuma v'gazar aleim mitzvos. L'umas ha'olam lo asar klum. God gave the Jewish people this mitzvah of kosher. It's not one of the entire world has a certain set of rules they have to follow, right? There's the 7 Noachite commandments, which everyone has to follow. But then the mitzvah of kosher is one of the unique areas which was only given to a Jew, which was given specifically, I should say, to the Jewish people. And the reason is because, and this touches upon it's almost as if Rashi over here is alluding to a certain mystical element, and that is that non-kosher food has characteristics to it that can then be brought into the human being who eats that food. And for that reason, God said, don't look at kosher. It's almost like, some people have a more sensitive system and therefore have certain allergies. God says your souls are a little bit more sensitive, and therefore your souls, which is connected to your body, cannot tolerate certain meats from a spiritual standpoint. Now, your doctor may not see it. It may not show up on the x-ray, but the soul is affected by the foods we eat. And we believe the foods we eat have within a certain energy, and you're bringing in that energy into yourself. And therefore, to some degree, one should be worried. If I'm eating an animal, so am I bringing in animalistic tendencies? Am I adding to animal tendencies to myself? One could argue based on that there's a certain righteousness not to eat meat at all. Because why would I add animalistic tendencies to my being? We hear so often about overcoming our animal instinct. And so therefore, one could argue that one should not eat meat at all. And by the way, there is an approach that some take that meat, in fact, it's the ideal approach, is that particularly when it comes to meat, when you're eating the meat of an animal that was killed, it should only be done in a frame of holiness. There are many people throughout history who would only eat meat on Shabbos, because otherwise there's several points. One is that I don't feel like my craving should justify the killing of an animal. Why should, just because I'm hungry or I enjoy a slice of beef, therefore an animal should be killed just to satisfy my cravings? There's something patently wrong about that. Now, Torah allows it. We're not suggesting that it's forbidden, but someone who lives on a higher plane can very easily make that calculation that why should I eat meat? Why should I allow an animal to be killed just for my pleasure? And that's putting aside the fact that we know that often when it comes to today's mass production of meat, sometimes animals are not treated very well. So therefore, one can very easily make that calculation. That being said, the Hasidic approach does not accept that as a conclusive point. Rather, Hasidism says you're right to a degree. It is correct that if the only goal of your eating right now is simply to enjoy meat, then there's some level of, it's to some degree inappropriate, not forbidden, but inappropriate that an animal has to give its life just for your simple pleasure. But if somehow you turn that meal into a spiritual experience, and most obviously that would be on Shabbos or on Yom Tov, or you use it very clearly to strengthen one's spiritual connection to God, then not only is it okay to have the meat, it can be said that one is actually elevating the animal and strange as it sounds, doing a favor to the animal, because the animal until this point never had the opportunity on its own to connect to God at such a level. But through the human being eating the meat with a very divine intention, then one has the right to, then it's even appropriate to eat that meat. That being said, coming back to what Rashi saying over here, he's saying that's true about some animals that when you consume their meat, you're able to elevate it. But there's some animals that for whatever reason, not they've done anything wrong. Animals are not held accountable for their behavior, but there's some characteristics that certain animals have. And therefore, if you are to bring that into yourself, and let's recognize the fact that when you eat meat, it becomes your meat. The meat you eat becomes your body. So there's some animals whose characteristics are negative to the degree that Torah says avoid it entirely, because the Jewish neshama is a little bit more sensitive to this. And that's why God says, this is a unique mitzvah that I'm giving to you, because I feel that you're a little bit sensitive. Just like some people are more sensitive to peanuts. And so the Jewish neshama is more sensitive and therefore cannot properly, won't be able to properly spiritually process certain meats. Okay, let's move on a little bit. Verse number 3. Now, an interesting Rashi, Zos Hachaya. Rashi emphasizes the fact that the pasuk doesn't say, God says to Moshe, these animals are kosher and these animals are not kosher. Instead, the wording is Zos Hachaya. Zos Hachaya literally means here, this animal is. Says Rashi, what this means is that Moshe would hold up an animal and show it to the Israelites saying, this one you may eat, this one you may not eat. And even with the water animals, he held each one up and said, this you may, and this you shall not. It was Moshe, which is a beautiful teaching skill, that visual teaching is important. And it's not just, especially in something so essential like what you can eat and what you can't eat. Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to be very clear. Therefore, he would hold up the animal and say, this kosher, this not kosher. And that's how he did it. That's what it says, Zosachai. Instead of saying these animals, this animal, indicating he was like literally showing them something. Verse number 3. Kol mafreses parsa, v'shosaas shasa prosos, malegera babehema osa tochelu. All animals any animal that has a cloven hoof that is completely split into double hooves, and which brings up its cud, that one you may eat. So the animals that one is allowed to eat have to have the two signs. One is a completely separated hoof, and that's important that it says completely separated, as opposed to a partially separated, because there's some animals which have a partially separated hoof. It has to be completely separated, and ma'alas gera, as well as it brings up, it regurgitates its ingested food from its stomach, returning the food to its mouth in order to thoroughly crush it and grind it thoroughly. So the animal which chews its cud, which continues to eat, is which it comes back and forth. It goes up and down to 3 or 4 different stomachs. So it chews, and then the food then goes to a different stomach. I mean, the most obvious example of this is a cow, which chews its cud, which keeps on chewing. As a total side point, there's another mitzvah which some link to this idea of chewing its cud. Most people, when they hear chewing the cud, what mitzvah is that relevant to? Kosher. But apparently there's those who understand another mitzvah in connection to this as well. And that is that one of the prohibitions against, when it comes to animals, is that you're not allowed to harness a cow and a donkey together. You're not allowed to harness them to the same yoke and have them pull the same yoke. Why not? Why may you not harness the word is lo sachrosh b'shor b'chamor yachtav. You may not have a donkey and an ox pulling the yoke together. So I think the most common explanation of it is because it's unfair. You're going to be asking the camel you're going to be asking the donkey to pull more than it naturally can, because the ox is a much stronger animal. And when you harness them together, it's going to cause the donkey pain, and that's why not. But I saw another interpretation, another explanation, also has to do with the uncomfortability of the animal, but a different idea. And that is like this. The donkey doesn't chew its cud. The cow chews its cud. So what's going to happen is the donkey is looking at the cow, and the cow seems to be eating the whole time. So it just sees the cow eating, and it seems like the owner, I didn't get any food, the donkey thinks. The owner is busy, must be feeding constantly the cow, the ox, because it's constantly chewing. I didn't get any food, and therefore it will cause unnecessary pain to the donkey, who assumes that the owner fed the other animal and didn't feed itself. So that is one explanation given as to why a cow or an ox and a donkey can't pull a plow together. Coming back to this idea of bringing up its food, and as Rashi explains, it brings up and regurgitates the ingested food from its stomach, returning the food to its mouth in order to thoroughly crush it and grind it thoroughly. Now, the Gemara says something very interesting. The Gemara says, the Gemara has a discussion on this. The Gemara in Tractate Chulin. Chulin is a tractate which talks a lot about the animals and what makes an animal kosher or not kosher. Says the Gemara that you want to know the simane chaya, You want to know which animal is kosher? So says the Gemara, Rabbi Dosa says, any animal that has horns, any wild animal that has horns. When I say wild animal, I don't mean wild as like I mean, like we said, a non-domesticated animal that has horns. You can be certain that it has hoofs as well. Just a second. That's what it says. That any animal that has horns, you can be certain that it has hoofs as well. And it says, very practically speaking, if you come across meat or an animal which was slaughtered, and you no longer see its legs were removed. It was slaughtered properly, but it doesn't have legs now. The animal was taken apart, but you do see the top of the animal. Says Rabbi Dosa, if it has horns, then you can be certain that it also has split hooves. That's a fascinating idea that now doesn't necessarily say if it chews its cud, but any animal that has horns, you can be certain that it also has split hooves. Now, whether that's actually used halachically or not, I don't know, but that's what the Gemara says in the name of Rabbi Dosa. But I do want to take this idea and explain it. Just share a mystical observation over here. We said earlier that there is, as we've often say in this class, that every part of Torah can be understood from a perspective of pshat, which means simple meaning, the remez, the hints, drush, where you can derive, soda, the secrets. So what are the deeper ideas behind these symbols, these signs? After all, God could have simply told us which animals are kosher. Elsewhere in the Torah, it actually lists 10 or 11 animals which have these signs. So why do you have to bother telling us split hooves? Chew its cud? Just tell us the following animals are kosher, like it says by birds, by the way. When it comes to birds, the Torah, there is no signs for a kosher bird. The Torah just tells us a list of 25 types of birds which are not kosher, and therefore we can derive that other birds are kosher. So over here, we know there's only about 10 animals or so which are kosher. If that's the case, why can't the Torah just tell us those 10, 12 animals? And then that's it. Then we know what we can eat. So therefore, the commentaries tell us, no, that these signs symbolize also something deeper. And different mefarshim, certainly those which focus on the mystical truths of Torah, explain what are the mystical ideas behind it. So I'll share. Let's see if I think we'll have time for one, and that is a split hoof. What is the message of the split hoof? So Rabbi explains a Chassidic interpretation of this is as follows: split hoof. So then you have two sides of the hoof which are split completely. The two sides are the right hand side and the left hand side. In Judaism, we often come across this idea of the right and the left. And the right represents the attribute of kindness. Kindness, there's many elements which fall under the umbrella of the right-hand side. Kindness, love, compassion. A lot of these, feelings that we have which draw us closer to another entity, like may draw us closer to a fellow human being, may draw us closer to God, but that which draws us closer, which makes us feel more connected to another, that usually falls under the right-hand side of kindness. And the left is severity, which is discipline, which in some way creates a distance, the idea of fear or awe or reverence. That all falls under the category of the left. And both of these, and when I revere God, I sense the greatness of God and the smallness of myself. This is a holy feeling, but it's very different than the feeling of love. It's to some degree a feeling of distance. And that's yira. That falls under the left-hand side of one's emotions. So it is very important when we serve God to challenge ourselves to serve God with both halves of our personality, that our relationship with God has to be one which includes love of Hashem and the closeness and the sense of connection and trust. All that fits into that right-hand side. I walk with the sense of that God loves me and I love God. But that's not enough. That's only half. That's half of our service of Hashem. A person has to challenge themselves and say, do I also revere God? Do I fear God? Do I feel the presence of God? Does it stop me from doing things I shouldn't be doing? just like in a healthy relationship with people. But certainly when it comes to God, there has to be the reverence and the fear and the awe and the trepidation of God. Now, someone may fall into a lifestyle in which they live entirely out of fear of God. And the only thing which motivates them in life is that I'm afraid of divine punishment, or, the presence of God scares me away from doing something. And they may forget the importance of being motivated out of love for Hashem. And a healthy spiritual connection to God is one which has both elements of my relationship with God, the ahava and the yira, the love and the fear, the reverence and the connection. And simultaneously, that's what motivates me to serve Hashem. The Tanya talks about it and describes it as the two wings of the bird. And a bird can't fly with one wing. And the mitzvahs and the Torah we study, that's the body, that's the makeup of the bird. But it's the love of God and the fear of God that causes us to fly, that causes our relationship with God to fly. And that's what the Tanya describes it as, the trei gadfim, the two wings of the bird. And so the Rabbi says this is the meaning behind the split hoof. The split hoof is a clear distinction between the right and the left, and the hoof is what the animal stands on. It's almost the idea that my relationship, that my foundation of my life stands on both sides, both the love and the fear. And there's a clear split between them, as you can very clearly distinguish and identify. This is love, this is fear. And then if somebody has that connection to God, which is the combination of love and fear, and they're standing on that, and that is a healthy connection with God, and that is a healthy relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that's one of the ideas explained, which gives the mystical idea behind one of the symbols of what makes an animal kosher. All right, we're going to stop here. I look forward to continuing our Torah study. God willing, next week we'll continue with the Torah portion of Tazria, and there'll be a lot of good stuff to study then. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a wonderful Shabbos, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're very welcome, Dan.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
You're welcome.
Shalom, shalom, Rabbi.
Shalom, shalom. Thank you. You're welcome, Nadia.